Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Latin American Anthropology Seminar series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a London-based seminar. It is hosted by CLACS at the University of London, and we are three conveners who jointly coordinate the seminar. Ainhoa Montoya at CLACS, Jessica Sclair at Queen Mary University, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, and me, Denise Roman, at the University of Aberdeen. This seminar runs fortnightly on Thursdays at 5 p.m. UK time. And well, you can check the program online. I believe Ainhoa is going to post the details in the chat box. And before I introduce today's speaker, just let me briefly ask you to keep your microphones muted. Our speaker will have 45 minutes to present, and then we will open up for a Q&A, aiming to finish around 6:30 UK time. So if you would like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function available on Zoom, or alternatively, you can post your questions on the chat box, and I will read those out. So I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dolores Señorans, from the University of Cambridge. She is going to present her paper, Suing Futures, Migrant Communities, Kinship and Precarious Labor in the Garment Industry in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires, Argentina. Dolores, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I wanted to really thank the organizers of this seminar series for the invitation to present my work. As Denise was saying, I'm currently a British Academy Newton International Fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. And what I'm going to present today draws on a longer research that I started in 2015, together with garment sector workers that form a part of the Popular Economy Workers Union in Argentina. Now, beginning in 2015, this union sought to organize these workers that were previously home-based workers working in family-owned sweatshops in their own homes by creating worker cooperatives that allowed them to transfer their work activities into common and safe places for production. However, what I want to present today goes a little bit backwards into the narratives and the life stories of these workers and how this precarious labor reality that before it was organized in the union and how it started to take shape around the early 1990s and 2000s. So I'm gonna share the screen now, sorry. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. And I'm sorry, but I'm gonna read. Okay. Margarita's voice was unhurried but firm. Her tone was sweet, but the content bitter. It was a cold morning in May 2019, and we were chatting next to a huge cutting table that sits right in the center of the cooperative of which she is a president today. There's a lot more to how we arrived here and how we improved. Nos superamos, she told me. I am from the indigenous countryside, and I could barely speak any Spanish when I left my village. She said to start a talk that had as an excuse a small text that I had written recounting her life. But she wanted to clarify some important aspects she wished to be present in that text. So she narrated her life again and decided to start her story in Villa Victoria, the rural village where she was born near Oruro in Bolivia. On her cell phone, she showed me a video of her carrying some belongings on her back as she walked across a field. To get to my parents' house, it takes about 6 hours walking like this, she says. And the sounds from the video bring in the wind and the vastness of the Bolivian countryside to a warehouse flooded with the beating noise of sewing machines. Although she remembers her hometown fondly and often returns to visit her aging parents, Margarita left the countryside to live in Oruro, the big city, at 18. There she met her husband, and her first 3 children were born. And also there, she learned the trade with which she would earn a living since then. She learned garment stitching, or to costurar. In 1995, she arrived in Buenos Aires with her husband and their children. Back then, the benefits of working in Argentina were vox populi among her relatives and acquaintances, so they decided to give it a go. They traveled to visit her brother-in-law, and she emphasizes just to visit, who had a sweatshop in the city and could pay for the tickets for the whole family. They stayed with them for a month or so, and of course agreed to pay them back. But Margarita's husband did not want to work with them. My husband told me, any little thing, any quarrel that arises, and we will get angry with family members, and that's not all right. With other people, you can get angry, and you'll never see that person again, but not with family. You risk not speaking to them again. So soon they accepted a job in a sweatshop owned by a fellow countryman from Margarita's hometown, located in Bajo Flores in the city of Buenos Aires. They worked and lived there only for 2 months, but that experience marked her forever. There I learned that my fellow countrymen are bad. That's why I said, I will never be like them. When I arrived, they make me work until 1, sometimes 2 in the morning. And remembering this experience, it's very clear that it was painful and she could not contain her tears. I didn't believe it at first, but I had to live it. They treated us very badly. My children were there crying all the time. They didn't give us enough food. We were really hungry. Her sister, who by then was also living in the city of Buenos Aires, offered them invaluable help to leave the place and find another job. She appeared there on a rainy night and had a taxi waiting outside. Margarita remembers very clearly how she framed the debate with the owners when they refused to let them leave. She told them that we were leaving because they were exploiting us, but that they didn't buy us, we were not their property. So after leaving that sweatshop in the following years, the family moved from one to another. Working conditions were always the same: low pay, low working hours, little space for the kids, and more often than not, very harsh treatment. So eventually they decided that enough was enough, and the couple got a room to rent in a shantytown in the city. Only then we started working for ourselves, and we were better off. We were paid directly by the manufacturers, she told me. And the family always stayed in garment production, but they also started to develop different tasks in the chain. And for the last 10 years, Margarita has been selling the garments she herself produces with the help of her children in a stall outside of La Salada, the largest popular market in Argentina. She described the fact that she had been selling what they make as working independently and without exploitation, a description that contrasts very deeply with how she remembers the experience of working for employers. In her own words, I work hard and I sell. I don't take advantage of the work of others. So the story of Margarita and her family resonates with that of so many others who came to Argentina from neighboring countries with the hope of improving their lives and of those of their families. Many had arrived between the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, a time in which the parity between the Argentine peso and the US dollar made Argentina a desirable destination for migrants who expected to send remittances to support their families. These migrant families and their communities became the main actors in the expanding universe of the garment sweatshops in Buenos Aires that supplied both formal sector brands and informal markets. However, for many years, this reality hid behind closed doors. But in 2006, things took a dramatic turn. A fire in a garment sweatshop in Buenos Aires, in which 5 children and a young pregnant woman died, unleashed a heated public debate on the labor conditions in the industry. Slavery, human trafficking, and servitude soon became the most common ways of describing this form of work, and much of the debate on this sector revolved around the question of why the workers endured and often accepted these conditions. For some, the answer could be found in the ancestral customs and traditions of the Bolivian workers, implying this form of labor was pre-capitalist and natural to these communities. And by some, I am fortunately referring to the federal judge that intervened in the court case after the fire, who said that this way of working could be equated to the ILU system in Bolivia. For others, these sites represented a deviation from capitalism, since extreme exploitation and enslavement was sustained by violence and deceit. And this was probably the most popular held opinion in left-wing activists and organizations that claimed that this was a form of modern slavery. Now, in this paper, I want to move beyond these binary views that often shift the blame towards the workers and their communities by exploring how workers navigated the entanglements of kinship, the community, and business while contesting these growing public accusations. Now, the entanglement between kinship and the economy has been a long-lasting topic of reflection for anthropologists. From the classic ethnographists that sought to understand systems of exchange in small-scale non-Western societies to more recent concerns on gender and reproductive technologies in the modern world, anthropologists have shown that kinship is not a distinct realm of social life defined by biological bonds, but rather a complex process of creating relatedness, as Jan Kasten argued, in ever-shifting social networks shaped by power and inequality. Now, in particular, recent anthropological reflections on labor within capitalism have returned to kinship and intimate relationships in an attempt to stress that labor-capital relations always occur through concrete experiences and relationships. Now, from this perspective, kinship, the community, the household, often depicted as essentially non-capitalist institutions, reveal themselves as key to modeling localized forms of capital accumulation and particular forms of surplus extraction. Therefore, this literature shows that these realms cannot be understood as separate, nor radically different from the universe of the market. However, in public discourse, intimate relations, and especially kinship, are often located within the realm of reproduction and associated to notions such as care and trust. But here I want to draw on Michael Pellet's work, who has argued in favor of bringing the conceptualization of ambivalence into anthropological studies of kinship. Pellet contends that kinship often evokes ambivalent emotions, multiple evaluative frameworks, and structures of feeling. In other words, that intimate relationships and those with kin can be felt and experienced as a source of safety, but equally of danger and potentially violence in changing circumstances. Now, this paper will address this ambivalence, examining how people navigated this entanglement of intimacy, kinship, and doing business, while trying to make sense of their circumstances and pursuing life projects driven by aspirations of improvement, as Margarita said, or progress and autonomy. However, we should not take these aspirations at face value, as they were not singular, but plural, in the sense that they elude easy, clear-cut classifications such as self-interest and generosity, economic gain, and community well-being. Additionally, I hope that bringing kinship in and the ambivalent emotions it evokes, their desires and moral dilemmas into analysis will allow us also to portray a more complex view of how this precarious labor reality took shape since the early 1990s and how it gradually changed by the action of the state, of the employers, but also of workers. For as Alana Shever's ethnography on the privatization of the state-owned company YPF in Argentina has shown, neoliberal projects of social and economic transformation are more grounded in kinship sentiments, obligations, and familial relationships that analysts have tended to recognize. At this point, a word of caution is needed. This analysis, or what I will present today, contains a political stance. It seeks to unsettle this dominance account of the industry and the sweatshops that have become its main production sites, which downplay the workers' agency and creativity and blame the migrant communities as part of the problem. In these narratives, flesh and bone workers, their families, and their intimate relationships, and the ones through which they hoped to build a better future, counteracting the inequalities they experienced and suffer, have been completely absent from the debates. So to do them justice, I wish to emphasize the social inequalities that political and economic structures inflict on their lives as migrant workers in a highly exploitative industry. I explore how they live with these inequalities in complex ways that include both acceptance, and contestation, involvement in economic initiatives for individual profit, and solidarity with kin and community members. My standpoint resonates with what Nicole Constable has called the limits of the agent-victim binary in the analysis of labor migration. In her ethnography with migrant working mothers in Hong Kong, she refused to depict these women either as passive victims who lack choice or active agents in full control of their circumstances. And she sought to contribute to the struggle for social justice by neither romanticizing these women or denying the exploitation and discrimination they experience. Instead, she wanted to see them as people, not just as workers, which involves addressing how people live with, submit to, or transform structures of oppression. So in a similar vein, in this paper, I do not wish to conceal the suffering that these workers endured, nor the bitterness that many of these relationships entailed, but neither to contribute to their victimization. And as they recognize and reflect on, they are neither passive victims nor vicious victimizers. So my argument will unfold following the lives of two garment workers and their families, Angela and leaders. And let us begin with Angela. Angela is a young mother of two and a very enthusiastic activist in the union these days. She contributed to create not one, but two cooperatives, and she's also actively engaged in gender politics, as you can see in the picture. But politics had never been her thing before, as she often told me, because she only had time to work and to take care of her children, nothing more, not even to have friends. She had arrived in Argentina in February 2007 to work at her cousin's garment sweatshop in the city of Buenos Aires. Her cousin had offered her $100 a month to pay for her travel expenses. And of course, she would have to pay him back once she started working. So far, so good, she thought. This might be a fair deal. However, once in Buenos Aires, she realized with great disappointment that the work conditions were harsher than she could ever expect. How she described the life in the sweatshop is almost identical to what so many others have told me over these years. They lived and worked in very precarious and small places, working from 7 in the morning until 2 in the morning with only very short breaks to eat. The pay was very low and only given if requested, and they rarely left the place for fear of being stopped by the police, as most of them did not have the legal documents to reside in the country. Now, this fear was reinforced by the owners, who did not want neighbors to see people coming in and out of the place because it would give them away to work inspectors. Because Angela had no previous experience in stitching, when she arrived, she started taking care of her cousin's baby and cooking for everyone. And in between, she started doing simple tasks, such as cutting threads or sewing buttons, until her cousin taught her how to use the machine. My cousin told me that he was giving me an advantage. He was helping me and teaching me how to use the machine. It's like you pay your dues and start as assistant or cook, and then you go up to the machine. The special metaphor is illustrative of the relationships within the universe of the sweatshops. She has ascended in the working rank by learning those precious skills. As workers receive piece rate payments, she believed that if she worked efficiently and long hours, this would improve her income. But her words also describe a particular kind of relationship with employers, or employing relatives, I should say, that matches very well but what Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui has conceptualized as differential reciprocity within the universe of the migrant sweatshops. In a clear contrast with the notion of slave that permeated the debate on this type of work, Rivera Cusicanqui argues that these bonds express an exploitative labor relation that is sustained by the expectation of paying one's dues, derecho de piso, as we would say in Spanish, to later progress to better work conditions and a better life. But as Angela would soon find out, that could never be an individual endeavor. Spending almost all her time in the sweatshop, the place became her home and a space to foster intimate relationships. There she met Benito, her husband, and father of her 2 children. Benito used to play football with other members of the Bolivian community in the Indoamericano Park every weekend. the sport and cultural activities were fundamental to build networks, share information, and most importantly, to compare their working conditions and pay with that of others, and to hear about new opportunities. There, among other fellow countrymen, Benito came to realize that they could leave the sweatshop and decided to make their, by then 3-year-old relationship public. We had to live as a couple, as a proper couple. Otherwise, it would have been very difficult, she explained to me. It was important to make it official. And then she elaborated that they knew that employers preferred couples for 2 main reasons. First, because by working together, they could deliver more production and quicker. And second, they were more reliable, and they would be expected to keep the job for longer. As she put it, single people work, they try it out for a bit, but maybe then they leave. But by 2014, the couple managed to become independent and started working from their own home. They bought 2 machines from their last employer, and Benito regularly went to ask around for work to Avellaneda Street, a street that is famous for the number of garment shops that sell bulk products made in local sweatshops at very low prices. But the manufacturers demanded quantity and did not trust that only a couple could provide it. So reluctantly, Angela had to fall back on her cousin, who by that time had opened his own shop and only distributed work to other sweatshops who worked for him. She did not like the idea, but they decided they had only 2 options. They could either work for him, as he would not demand too much, or get at least 10 more people to live and work with them, according to the manufacturer's demands. And that would have involved building rooms in the roof of their home, as she recalls, laughing, to highlight the irony of the fact that the only way to become independent was to make other workers dependent on them. Now, how Angela narrates her migration to Argentina, her first steps in the industry, and building her family show that kinship, intimate relationships, and community networks were key to consolidating this outsourced system in the textile industry and to disseminating family forms of production in the workers' homes. The piece rate payment system allowed the dominant actors in the industry to enlarge their profits without bearing the cost of the reproduction of labor, which was transferred to the most vulnerable segments of the supply chain. But also, both when they were employed by others and when they became independent by working in their homes, these relationships became fundamental relations to produce commodities. The fact that employers and manufacturers preferred couples indicates that building a family was not only an intimate issue, but also critical to continue in the business. Thus, intimacy, kinship, and the community anchored forms of labor exploitation and were not necessarily harmonious. And Angela's relationship with her cousin, her ambivalence towards him, her disappointment with the work conditions he offered, but later her kind of gratefulness for having helped them, shows that kinship and the community were not, as I said, harmonious. However, the fact that she and her partner sought different places to work and even built their own place shows that they were highly reflective on these ambivalences and actively mobilized or created relationships that allowed them to pursue a better life, even in highly adverse circumstances. Especially because after the fire in 2006, growing police harassment and raids became an everyday concern, and many workers narrated the fear and constant stress that they endured as they felt they had to live and work in hiding. Between 2007 and 2015, Angela and Benito endured at least 8 police raids in their workplaces. 6 of them took place in her cousin's sweatshop, and another one in their own home that ended up with a court order closure and the imprisonment of a woman that was working with them. In the context of growing up accusations of exploitation and slavery within the sweatshops, workers started to claim that working as a family was also a very important way to protect themselves and of stating that they were not committing a crime. Now, of course, not all of these workers had blood relatives or relatives in the country to whom they could turn to find a job and secure a livelihood. However, we should not see kinship as a pre-given relationship or the family as a fixed entity, but rather as a practice of creating relatedness. As Leader Stories points out, the industry also allowed many workers to forge kin-like bonds. I met him in the winter of 2018. He was the president of a cooperative in the southern part of the Conurbano Bonaerense, the area around the city of Buenos Aires, where I visited him very regularly. We would drink mate together at least one morning a week to talk about anything from everyday concerns in the cooperative, paperwork I often helped him with, national politics, and the latest developments in the ever worsening economic situation in Argentina. He was a singular man, canny for business, but also hugely interested in politics, not necessarily the typical character you would expect to see as a militant and leader of a social movement and a labor union. He arrived alone in Argentina from Santa Cruz de la Sierra, Bolivia in 1998 when he was 34. It was not his first journey. He has also left his rural hometown, Los Negros, to live in the big city with his grandfather when he was 12. In Bolivia, he had worked his entire life as a bus driver, and for 10 years, he had been the general secretary of a driver's trade union. But towards the end of the 1990s, he decided it was time to leave. He reflected, I worked for many years in Bolivia, and I never saw how I would be able to make any progress. I wouldn't have been able to buy a house. Maybe I could get a car, but not more than that. I really struggled in Bolivia so much. In the bus to Argentina, he met a man who took him to a cheap guest house in the neighborhood of Paternal where he could stay, and the owner of that guest house took him to a sweatshop the very next day. What followed is what you can by now picture quite well. He worked in many sweatshops for a very low pay and in pretty dire conditions. But this is not the part of the story that Leaders usually wants to emphasize. More often, he would tell me about what happened after he and his wife started to think about independence. I realized that if this fellow countryman came to have all of this, with many employees like us, I thought to myself, well, why can't I do it? But the desire of independence, nevertheless, took several years to achieve. Until one day, the couple got a new job in Villa Celina in the province of Buenos Aires. This time, they could rent a separate room from the owner of the sweatshop, who happened to be also a neighbor from Leader's hometown in Bolivia. So he became a really important person in their life. This having come from the same place connected them in a very special way. As Leaders remembers, he told me, you will never be an employee again. You will live here, I will give you the house, and you will pay me later. If you need money, I will lend it to you, he told me. This was a very important step for us to have our own sweatshop. And it went very well. Leaders and Cecilia proudly told me that at one point they had 30 machines. They rented a place in Villa Celina, bigger this time, and employed numerous workers. They had so many work orders coming in that they also shared some of that work with Cecilia's brother and his wife, who were working in their own home. However, it didn't last. In 2012, they left for 2 weeks to the province of Córdoba. He had met a man that gave him the option of moving his business there. He considered the idea because he really thought that that would improve their position. Plus, the family had never been on a holiday. So he decided to buy a new SUV and drove with the family together. Looking back, he regrets having told the owner of the place that they were renting that they would be away. They returned to find that everything had been stolen, and according to him, it was out of envy. The man told the workers that they would not come back and therefore would not pay their wages. This had incited them to take anything they could find and leave. Cecilia narrated this, emphasizing a great disappointment. I did not feel that they were employees at all. To me, they were like my family. If we had meat, everyone had meat. If we had rice with a fried egg, everyone had rice with a fried egg. She described their effort to create equality by sharing food, something that diverged considerably from her previous experiences when working from others, when the difference in food between owners and employers was very stark. So once again, they had to start from scratch. And as the family could not afford the room they were living in anymore, they had to move to Campo Tongi, a popular neighborhood in Lomas de Zamora, in the province of Buenos Aires, which was created in 2008 after a land occupation. And there they rented a wooden shack and asked around for work. The neighborhood was full of sweatshops working for the nearby market of La Salada. Now, for some time, Cecilia went to work for her brother, but leaders did not want to go himself because he felt it was a disgrace to be the employee of someone he used to employ in a way. Later, Cecilia also felt mistreated, and this left the couple with great bitterness towards this relative that they thought had treated them worse than employees when things started to go bad for them. As they grew a distance from these relatives, they drew closer to new people from the neighborhood who'd help them. Leaders became compadre, a term that in Latin America describes the relationship between the parents and godparents of a child, to a fellow countryman and neighbor, when that he offered, and they became very close after, he offered to lend them some machines that he didn't own himself, to complete some garments and be able to sell them. They would go to his house very late at night after he had finished working to use those machines. And this man also introduced Leader to a group of Bolivians who were organizing a pasanaco in the neighborhood, a collective system of savings and financing that is widely used by the Bolivian community and pretty much dependent upon trust and being introduced to trust groups, which allowed him to grow in the business, buying new machinery and getting some supplies. Certainly, he was not the only. Many of these initiatives that he undertook did not end up well. In one particular case, all his garments were stolen, for example. So he often narrated how he experienced many tumbles. And many times I heard the story of how in the face of these misfortunes, in which, borrowing his own words, they lost everything and had to start again. They did it again and again to put bread on the table, to provide for the children with what they needed to go to school and also to improve their homes. But in Leader's case, at times he found the strength to try again and to try again in these initiatives to achieve more mundane desires. I really wanted to buy back the SUV, he told me up front one morning before going into the details of an initiative he had undertaken with Cecilia. They had decided to cut and stitch T-shirts in their own home in Tongi and sell them directly at La Salada. But as I said, that didn't go well. And everything was stolen one night when they were arriving. So they were basically left with nothing to sell and a debt they had taken to buy the materials to repay. Now, in his ethnography with stall owners precisely from La Salada, Matthias Dewey found that the micro-level practices associated with economic activities within the marketplace were linked to certain aspirations, such as the desire to access certain goods or services, or the wish to maintain living standards that had clearly improved after entering the marketplace. And these aspirations were not an emerging byproduct of business success, he claims, but quite the opposite, a disciplining force of everyday attempts to make better business deals, improve pieces of clothing, or more efficient forms of organizing productions. Therefore, Dewey suggests that economic decisions must be explained with regards to a socially constructed future. However, apart from the fact that leaders did not precisely achieve business success, his story also reveals that for him the future was not singular and that his inventiveness was not only put to the service of individual economic initiatives. At the same time, he was undergoing these initiatives to buy back the SUV. Together with his wife and other neighbors, he was organizing a soup kitchen in the neighborhood where they served snacks for almost 200 children, getting donations from social movements and the local government. This experience, which he often recounted with lots of pride and even kept the flag with the name of the soup kitchen that used to hang at the entrance, shows that the desire for individual and family progress can coexist with forms of struggle and organization for community well-being. But I would argue, not even the desire of economic gain and access to the consumption of certain goods and services has to be examined more closely, because it also relates to pride, most notably, and to the search for respect. For him, rebuying that SUV represented the amendment of his previous failure when they intended to move to Córdoba and his whole workplace was ransacked. Now, the life stories of these workers show that in the context of a process of international migration, kinship, intimate, and community relationships became fundamental social relations of reproduction in this burgeoning outsource industry. These relationships facilitated migration and the projection of a better future in a new country, but also provided opportunities to earn a livelihood. Workers relied on those ties to learn the job and to develop in the garment sector, but also to create new meaningful and intimate relationships in their destination as they pursued progress and autonomy. Their stories portray that intimacy, the family, and the community are mutually constitutive of capitalist social relations, and that labor is lived and performed through concrete relationships with others. Moreover, as family scholars have long argued, capital accumulation is sustained by women's unpaid labor in the home. However, in the garment industry, the reproduction of labor and women's work and the intimate social ties that it fosters were not confined to what is often conceptualized as a distinct domestic sphere, especially when families began setting up their initiatives at home. There, intimate relationships were also integral to the configuration of capitalist production, and these networks brought together the production of commodities and the reproduction of the labor force in the sweatshop industry. Thus, in this case, production and social reproduction cannot be conceptualized as activities that take place in distinct sites, nor through radically different relationships with contrasting rationalities. Or as Viviana Selicer has famously argued, that the market and intimate forms of sociality are not altogether hostile worlds, even if people and social scientists insist on placing moral boundaries between them. Now, Selicer's work allows us to question the assumption that the market is defined by calculation, competition, and potential exploitation, while the relationships with kin and fellow community members rest on disinterested solidarity, reciprocity, and mutual aid. On the contrary, these workers' lives show that the family, intimacy, and the community contributed to finding a job that could be experienced as painful as and exploitative, but also contributed to saving capital, to investing, and to developing their own independent initiatives. The industry and doing business allowed them also to create kin-like bonds of trust. And none of these entanglements between intimacy and the economy were lived without conflict, as relatives and fellow countrymen could be seen both as refuge or sometimes also as a source of deceit and exploitation. But workers nevertheless relied on and negotiated these ties in the search for a better life and a better future. Now, like Margarita, Angela, and leaders, many more have told me with bitterness their past experiences in their sweatshops. For these workers, the experience had left a scar that was very hard to forget. It was an experience that persistently returned to the present, sometimes as a memory, but other times as a ghost. How come you never heard of the beheaded worker, el costurero sin cabeza? Luisa exclaimed in awe while we were having lunch at the cooperative that Leaders precisely is the president of. Other three women laughed out loud as I self-consciously looked down to indicate that I had never heard of it. She took the lead to explain. It is a myth of the time of the exploitation, when the first Bolivians came here to Buenos Aires to work in the sweatshops. They exploited you, they wouldn't let you go out, you know that. Since then, he sometimes shows up at night if you're working alone on the machine and looks at you. That's why we're afraid to be working alone in the workshop at night. He's a lost soul, un alma en pena. He himself worked at a sweatshop, but his boss cut off his head when he demanded the wages he was owed. And now he wanders through the workshops and scares those who are working alone at night. The conversation followed, half serious, half jokingly. However, shared laughter and humor aside, all the women subscribed to the story and were adamant that it would frighten them to death to see the beheaded worker in their workplace. One of them narrated that one time, while working late at night at home, she had been confronted by another lost soul, a small baby that appeared inside his buggy. And Cecilia, Leader's wife, told me that she hadn't seen him, but that when they had the workshop at their current home before setting up the cooperative, she could hear the machines functioning on their own at night, even when she knew that there was nobody there to operate them. Another worker, Blanca, on the other hand, told me a very different version of this tale that was passed on to her by an elder woman that she had met at La Salada. The woman explained that the young Bolivian had been working in Buenos Aires for 2 or 3 years and had saved quite a sum of money. He traveled to Bolivia to invest that money in something, maybe a plot of land, a house, maybe a car. But he arrived in his house where his mother, sister, and brother-in-law lived. And his brother-in-law offered to introduce him to an acquaintance that was selling a car, and they set off to see him the next morning. He was taking the money with him in case he would decide to buy it, but never got around to do it because his brother-in-law killed him by decapitation to get hold of his savings. As weeks went by and he didn't show back at work, his employer in Buenos Aires found it strange and started to ask his colleagues to see where they had news. They didn't until strange things started to happen in the workplace. Sounds of machines working, pedals moving, displacing things, lights going on and off. So the workers complained that a strange presence was upsetting them, and the employer immediately thought it must be a lost soul. So she decided to pay a visit to the Amautas, a person that could read the future in coca leaves in the neighborhood in Liniers. The Amauta confirmed that a lost soul was wandering in the sweatshop and offered to give her to go there to clean the place and release his soul. Only after 3 months, the mother of the worker confirmed that it was him who died when the brother-in-law appeared with a new car and it was discovered that he had killed him that morning for the money. Now, despite having asked many more workers from the Bolivian community if they had heard of the tale of the beheaded worker and what was his story, no one else ever wanted to go into too much detail. Most acknowledged it, but dismissed it as a popular belief not worth telling, pure habladurías or gossip. Some told me they barely knew anything about who he was or what he did when he made himself present. Perhaps they did not want to talk to me about it. Perhaps there are many more versions than just 2. However, these versions I do know are revealing cautionary tales. In the first one, it alerts of the consequences of disobeying work discipline enforced by employers and offers a hyperbolic account of the violence perpetrated in exploitative labor relationships and environments. In the second version, however, it highlights the intricacies and the ambivalences of precisely kinship. As the devious brother-in-law kills the worker to get his money, the narrative contains a warning not to entirely trust your relatives, for even they can betray you. It exposes the fragility of trust and its dangers. But the story is not only a word of caution, it is also a collective reflection on a complex reality that many had to actually endure. This collective reflexivity allows us to go back to a fundamental political issue, rather than searching for an explanation of why they accepted and subjected themselves and others to these work conditions. Maybe we should try to understand how. And by doing so, these workers seem less like gullible and submissive people that fall into any tricks, and more like humans that engaged in complex negotiations of trust and aspirations within intimate and kin relationships to pursue their dreams. They are neither pure victims nor completely free agents. The political economy of the sector shaped the circumstances under which these forms of control of the workforce developed, and these dilemmas effectively arose. The garment sector in Argentina and its precarious lived reality came to life in the intersection of these migration trends, ethnicity, and kinship, and intimate relationships that are often conceptualized as what guarantees social reproduction within the domestic sphere became fundamental social relations of production in the manufacturing of commodities for the market. Now, as capitalist accumulation occurred in the ambiguous realm of intimacy, kinship and the community turned into an ambivalent and potentially conflicted terrain as well. The family could be protection, but also a source of deceit and exploitation, or even social capital that could help build autonomous economics initiatives to invest and prosper. In this humanly universe, trust had to be earned, and pride, for instance, by refusing to be the employee of relatives who treat you badly, was a powerful force that made the desire for autonomy sprout. Nothing was ever static, and the road to Rome's could be many and meandering. Initiatives often went wrong, relationships could turn sour, and the prospect of failure and having to start again was always around the corner. As much as families could do business, business could make families. But a line had to be drawn somewhere, as the boundary between prosperity and taking advantage of others was very slim. The tale of the beheaded worker also speaks of moral dangers of ambition and greed, of placing too much desire in just making money. It is striking that the main character of the tale lost precisely his head. In Spanish, perder la cabeza is a common popular expression that refers to losing one's better judgment, and money is certainly considered one of the most corrupting presence in the modern world. But against the backdrop of these commonly held assumptions on the dirty nature of money or how it can make people lose their minds, and also of the social views that were casting upon these migrant workers, the plural nature of their aspirations and the pursuit of progress must be emphasized. Money to return to the country, to send remittances to family members back home, or to simply buy a car or any other conspicuous consumption item coexisted with community initiatives, such in the case of leaders and the soup kitchen. Now, years later, these community, intimate, and kin relationships that were critical to the production of commodities for the market and to capitalist accumulation, as I said, were also turned into the basis of the development of a collective organization that sought to extend citizenship and transform unequal supply chains, the textile branch within the popular economy workers' union. Now, after this, ambivalence, of course, did not disappear, and neither did the plurality and aspirations and desires that continued to drive workers' efforts in these cooperatives. However, these were rather turned into political issues to address and sometimes to contain or even to avert. But how and under what circumstances this happened, I think would be another tale. Thank you.